One thing I forgot to mention is, what oil do you put your brushes in when you're storing them? So kind of back to the same question and consideration is the various qualities of how the oils dry. Some people think that using safflower oil is great because safflower oil almost doesn't dry at all. But the issue with that is you don't necessarily want to be having like a residue of an oil that doesn't dry very well that is then somehow still on your bristles when you're painting. So I advise against that. And then the other alternative, the other extreme is linseed oil. But like if you're storing your brushes in oil, you don't want the brush to dry. So you wouldn't really want to be storing it in the oil that has the most reactive content of fatty acids. So I think in that case, walnut oil is kind of ideal. If the brush did dry, the film is softer, it'll be easier to clean up afterwards. So I prefer also, I prefer walnut oil as my medium. I also prefer it as the way to put away my brushes.
But you would do that even though you paint with linseed oil?
Yes. It would be...
Because there's no problem if there's a little bit of residue of walnut oil and you paint with...
Right, because walnut oil is still a good drying oil,
yeah,
even though it's a different one from linseed oil.
Right, and it's not... The walnut oil wouldn't be dripping from a brush, presumably. Yeah. So, okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then, to transition, we could talk about how in this little display of how the two oils dry. So we set up a little diagram, but the ground was a little bit too absorbent of the oil, so it dried much quicker than I expected it would. But what we have here is one square of a layer of black and white oil paint from a tube mixed with some walnut oil and then applied with a palette knife. And then over here we have a layer of linseed oil with the same color in the same kind of proportions mixed with the oil.
Yeah. And just to say that there was a layer underneath here, no sanding or anything like that was done. So this purling here, which seems kind of, it's not how you want it to look. That's just for demonstration, or that was not intended.
Right. And that has to do with the oiliness of the two layers being exactly the same.
So that's a perfect illustration then.
Yeah, of what happens when you don't make the underlayer have porosity and tooth, which you can make with sanding and wiping it with solvent, creating a little bit of a surface for the new layer to hold on to.
Well, if you sand also, you sort of get that physical connection like that, yeah.
Tooth.
Yeah.
So yeah, we didn't create tooth before we put this layer on.
Yeah. So it's a good example of not following lean to fat.
Yeah, not preparing the surface for the next layer, either by making the under surface more lean or making the new surface more fat. Yes.
Perfect.
Yep. So what even though I was planning to paint into these layers to demonstrate the kind of the pull, I realized just rubbing, my thumb on it, you can see how the walnut oil, the whole layer kind of dries together. Mm-hmm. So when I'm rubbing it off with my thumb, it's the entire layer is kind
moving,
of is the same level of dryness. Whereas the linseed oil, because the oil contains a fatty acid that is more reactive to oxygen, so it's like more quick and aggressively reacting
on the surface
to oxygen. It's more of like a skin, and then it's wet underneath.
That's a perfect illustration.
Yeah. So now it's on my thumb, whereas the walnut oil, it didn't do that. It was clean.
Right.
Yeah. So and when you're working on a painting that's wet, and this is an example of the open period and how the two oils, the closing of the open period. I mean, we could look at it that way. Walnut oil, it's like the whole layer is starting to turn more viscousy and solidify. And until your brush can't push it around or like, you know, influence the color one way or another, then it's, you know, it's kind of that layer is dry. Whereas with linseed oil, you'll start to notice that you're running into this problem where you have this like skin, and then it starts making these little breaks, and you've got these like crumbly bits that are, you know, partially
So what
wet.
you're arguing then is that in terms of conservation or how long it would last, because different layers can dry differently, and with this, if you know, even if it's semi-dry or you know at least that there is a solidity in the whole layer that makes you can trust it more. What you see, what you feel on the surface. Yes.
Okay. And also, I know this kind of chemistry can be a little bit confusing. The more reactive fatty acid is, you know, predominant in linseed oil, whereas it's a smaller percentage in the walnut oil, and then the walnut oil has a much bigger percentage of a slightly less reactive fatty acid. So when it dries a little bit slower, but the whole layer dries at the same speed rather than really fast on the top of the skin. And that's what linseed oil does.
Right.
And because of that more consistent through the layer drying, in terms of its like impermeableness to weather and atmosphere, the walnut oil paint film is more durable, even though it's physically softer.
Right.
It's just more thoroughly bonded. The lipid chains are more thoroughly connected.
Right. And in that demonstration we did, that we really went into detail about this. I don't remember if we covered it there, but how would it be if you if you want to start with something that is more open, you start with walnut oil. Can you go over to linseed oil?
Can you mix them together?
Like in let's say first 3 layers you use walnut oil, and then you change to linseed oil. Can you do that?
Linseed oil is better underneath as far as linseed oil is a better ground, but you can mix them. You can mix oils in the same painting, but it's better to use linseed oil as a ground than it is walnut oil, because walnut oil is slower.
Okay, yeah.
So better to have linseed oil underneath and walnut oil on top.
So you would follow that also in the paint layers in that case.
Yeah.
If you should. Yeah.
I don't think it's a huge thing to be concerned about.
Okay.
Because I know that, you know, in the Renaissance they used different oils for different parts of the painting, for different things. You know, like for lights they might have used poppy oil. For you know, certain other colors they may have preferred walnut oil. For other colors they may have preferred linseed oil. They were kind of using different oils for different pigments, and or for different passages of paint. Like if they needed you know, if it needed to be a more fluid, long brush stroke, they use poppy oil. Or if they needed a lot of like transitionary blending, like in a flesh tone, they would use walnut oil. Or, you know, so the oils were just part of the vocabulary of the studio, the different options in terms of like what quality they wanted the paint to have. So, you know, in the end, it's just walnut oil is an option that I think people should know about for its various qualities, and just to like not think that oil painting is just linseed oil.
Thank you for checking out this video from the School of Apelles. Go to caveofapelles.com/subscribe and access our premium library. That's caveofapelles.com/subscribe.